And everyone is coming in. Welcome. We will get started in just a minute. So our attendees are coming in. We will give them just a couple seconds to all get settled, and then I will start us off with today's coffee chat.
Great.
All right, and for the sake of time, greetings everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Ren Lovegood and my pronouns are they, them. I am the Senior Manager of the Leadership Excellence Networks, also known as LENS, at the National Center for Healthcare Leadership. Welcome to NCHL's September Coffee Chat, in which we'll be focusing on transforming unconscious bias into conscious inclusion. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to note. First, if you have any questions or comments for the panelists, please submit them directly into the Q&A section of the webinar. While we're going to try to hold time for questions. Should we not get to them, we'll do our best to address them offline following the completion of our event. We are recording today's session and it will be available on our YouTube channel within 3 business days. Additionally, a link to the recording will be sent to all registered attendees. In an effort to increase accessibility, we're utilizing Zoom and have enabled closed captioning. Should you wish to enable your own closed captioning during the event, please click the closed captioning button on the bottom of your Zoom window. NCHL values promoting diversity and inclusion in our events and equitable access. So we do welcome feedback regarding ways in which we can improve the accessibility of our events. Please reach out to me directly by email, lens@nchl.org, with any thoughts, comments, concerns, or suggestions regarding how we can leverage and improve our accessibility. Last but not least, today's session is a precursor to a deep dive into the topic by our speakers, which will be hosted at NCHL's all-member conference, November 14th through 16th in Chicago. We will send out additional information following today's webinar. And so, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists or our speakers. Clarissa Peterson is Senior Consultant with NuBrick Partners, an author, speaker, and former Chief Human Resources and Ethics Officer who has led diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in 3 different organizations nationally and globally. She is inspired to transform the lives of individuals, teams, and organizations through leadership coaching and consulting. Also joining us is Dave Apino. He is the principal of Furst Group and chief operating officer of NuBrick Partners, where he applies his breadth of executive search, business development, research, strategy, and product development experience to support NuBrick Partners' community of consultants in the design and delivery of the most effective leadership solutions for clients. Clarissa and Dave, thanks so much for joining us today and leading this really, really valuable conversation. I'm really looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that very kind introduction, Ren. We appreciate NCHL for all the great work that it does and for the opportunity to dive into a subject that is so important to all of us at work and in our everyday lives. I'm also excited to partner with Clarissa here, who I admire so much for, among other things, her wisdom and the ease with which she can wade into really difficult or uncomfortable concepts. And I would say unconscious bias is one of those concepts. And today we'll be discussing different approaches that we can take to overcome or at least minimize our biases. So to get things started, again, welcome, Clarissa. And I'll just kick it off with, what is unconscious bias? Why do we have it? And what do we do with it?
Well, Dave, first of all, good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you as well. I always enjoy working with you. So what is unconscious bias? Let's go to the next slide. It's really those assumptions that we make about other people, assumptions that are based on our gut, usually not reality, but interpretation. We try to group people into these categories, sometimes individuals. It may come from something that's happened to us. It may come from nothing. But you know what, Dave? We all have unconscious bias. You have it, and I have it, and everybody on this call has it. I see somebody out there who says you don't have it, but you have it too. It has to do with the way our brains work. But let's go to the next slide where we talk about some examples of unconscious bias. So for instance, I went to the University of Maryland, and let's say I'm a hiring manager, Dave, and I may say to my talent acquisition team, I only want to see resumes from graduates of the University of Maryland because they're the best. Well, that's affinity bias. Or I may say, hey, this person, I saw their picture on their resume. They're a little bit too young. They're not seasoned enough for this job. Or, gosh, I can't hire Clarissa. She has no energy. She's too old for this job. Well, that's called ageism. So I won't go through this whole list, but the point is when we start to use unconscious bias to make judgments about other people, it becomes very dangerous. It
Right.
becomes very, very problematic. So on the next slide, uh, I want to talk a little bit about how our brain works. But before I get to that, there's this really great book, Dave, called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's by psychologist Daniel Kahneman. And Daniel Kahneman says we have two sort of systems of thinking. We have system one thinking, where 95% of the way our brain works is unconscious, it's automatic. Now, that part of our brain, Dave, is called the amygdala. This is our fight or flight part of the brain that kept humanity alive back when we were running from saber-toothed tigers and all kinds of scary creatures. It was the thing that helped us make quick decisions. But here's the challenge with the amygdala, Dave. Sometimes and often, it doesn't know the difference between being chased by some scary creature or having a dispute with someone across the conference room table because it sees both of these things as a threat. So it's our fight or flight reflex. It's important, but just because it's a part of our brain doesn't mean we are hostage to it. Because Daniel Kahneman also reminds us that the other 5% of our brain, our system two thinking, is where logic resides, is where we're a little more careful about how we think, is where we're processing. That's in our prefrontal cortex. The interesting thing about the prefrontal cortex is when that part of our brain is activated, that's where we start to feel empathy. So,
Mm.
in addition to logic, that's where empathy comes from. That's where the part of the brain stimulates that.
Wow. So it sounds like our brain is actually looking out for us. You know, it's attempting to process all this data that's coming our way to keep us from death or injury or to overcome any sort of real or perceived threat. So it sounds like we need this ability to make decisions throughout the day, but it's also, while it's a lifesaver, it's also really limiting if we only use our amygdala or that part of our brain. So what are some
That's
steps we
right.
could take? What are some steps we could take to overcome these limits?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about two tactics that we can use to transform unconscious bias, Dave. So the first one we're going to talk about is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence came out of psychology, and it came into the business world with the publishing of the book by Daniel Goleman called Emotional Intelligence, published the book, and I think in 1995. And the book is really about how our gaining awareness as how our emotions impact other people, how those emotions impact us, and of course, how those emotions impact other people. So we're going to focus on two parts of emotional intelligence. There are five tenets, but for the purposes of transforming unconscious bias, I want to talk about a couple this morning. The
Mhm.
first is self awareness. And again, self awareness is really about how do I think about my own emotions? When those emotions start to rise, asking yourself, why am I feeling this way? For instance, let's say I got a new boss, Dave, and that boss reminds me of Boss X, who was just ghastly to work with. And the person looks just like Boss X. I had to do a double take to make sure it wasn't Boss X. And now I'm automatically making assumptions about how horrible this person's going to be. Well, self
Sure.
awareness would say, Clarissa, stop. Wait a minute. Hold it. Why are you thinking this? This person didn't even do anything to you. You don't even know them. So it's really questioning yourself, questioning those assumptions, and being mindful when these emotions start to crop up. Say, I'm starting to feel a certain way. Let me
Yeah.
step back and think differently. And then the second one is self regulation. Dave, have you ever had one of those emails somebody wrote you one of those emails and you just like, oh, and you just can't wait to get on your keyboard and write back. Well, when you don't do that, that's called self-regulation. Okay, maybe I should just take a breath. Maybe
That-
I should take a walk. Maybe I need to breathe. But let's say you write that email anyway. You're like, you know what? I'm writing that Clarissa back. I can't believe she sent me that email. Own it. Apologize. We're human. We're not perfect. That
Right.
amygdala took over. It took over your self regulation.
Sure.
So own your behavior, call it out, and learn from it. It's about being accountable. One of my friends says when you're self regulated, it's what grown ups try to do most of the time.
Hmm. Oh, yeah.
So
That
these are
just,
just two tenets of emotional intelligence.
I love it. As you're describing the email, I was like, I was getting triggered there a little bit and I had to like, pause a little bit. Um, But I just think about these two elements, particularly the self-awareness, which really that is a platform for effective leadership. Just understanding where am I right
Mhm,
now? What are these emotions that I'm feeling? What is my body telling me? I think it was
mhm.
Dan Siegel who said, if you can name it, you can tame it. So really taking the time to understand those emotions, and then the
Yes.
self-regulation piece. Both of these speak to what Daniel Kahneman said, of just giving yourself time to move into that system two thinking. And then I look at that against the backdrop of just the busyness of our work days, at
Yeah.
present, as they've been the last number of years, of how we're moving from back-to-back meetings and trying to keep up and overcome the pressures of the day. Boy, if we could find time, create time and space to think and process, that'll be a real game
Mhm.
changer. So
Absolutely.
as we move into that second strategy of allyship, Clarissa, please give us a little bit more insight about that concept.
Sure. So allyship is the process of building lifelong relationships with people who may be different than you, based on trust, based on honesty, based on listening to someone else's story. And it's about looking at the world, attempting to look at the world through the experience of someone else, through their lens. So, interestingly enough, when we talk about allyship, sometimes people don't understand what it is. Can everybody be an ally? Absolutely, we can all be allies. And again, just here on the slide, very quickly, sharing what you've learned from someone else's journey and someone else's story, it's so powerful and so important. Using your privilege for good. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about privilege, Dave, because sometimes that word can be polarizing.
Yeah.
We all have privilege. Privilege does not mean that you didn't have hardship in life. Privilege didn't doesn't mean that you didn't work hard. We all have had hardships in life. But everyone on this call has some sort of privilege. We may have positional privilege by virtue of the jobs we hold. We may have educational privilege by the education that we all have. We may have financial privilege. We may have privilege in terms of health. Whatever it is, using that privilege for good to lift someone else up and to help them. I want to read you a definition of privilege that I came across, and I want to read it because I want to say it verbatim. I want to attribute it to Rachel Thomas, who's the CEO of leanin.org. She says privilege is all of the invisible benefits you have as you move throughout the world. I often think of it like headwinds and tailwinds. The more privileges you have, the more tailwinds you have to push you forward and make things easier for you to navigate the world. Having less privilege is like heavy headwinds coming at you. Everything is just harder and takes more effort. And I thought that was just a really beautiful way of describing what privilege is and reaffirming that we all have it. So be curious, learn about it, dig deeper, Google the word privilege, read some books, talk to your friends, but also understand that with allyship, you'll make a mistake. You may say the wrong thing, or you may be afraid you're going to say the wrong thing.
Hmm.
That's where emotional intelligence ties into allyship. If you say the wrong thing, say, I'm sorry. What
Right.
could I have said differently? I'm learning. I'm on this journey. Help me.
Yeah. That's great. It's being vulnerable, but not being afraid to wade into that discomfort. I just love how the
Right.
synergy of the emotional intelligence with allyship. So it's almost like internal to external, or our thoughts and feelings to now applying them, putting them into action.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Um, I know you're gonna share Grandma Annie's story, but Clarissa, could you also mention some of the research that you uncovered on just how similar we all are?
Thank you, Dave. Yes. There was a project done called the Human Genome Project. I think it started in 1990, if I'm correct. And basically, they were attempting to map the human genome. And the genome is really our DNA instructions, sort of our DNA highway, if you will. And the question was, how much do humans differ genetically? So this was a global study with many hospitals and universities around the world. And at the end of the day, in 2003, when it was completed, the answer is all humans share 99.9% of the same human genome. The 0.1% that's different is how we look, our skin color, our gender. But the mapping, the construction of a human being is pretty much the same. And Dave, that's why when I think about all the isms, how ridiculous they are, because we're all the same. But this brings me to a story I'd like to share with you about my grandma Annie. And I think Grandma Annie taught me about diversity and inclusion, and she didn't even know it. And neither did I, frankly. So, Grandma Annie was a child of the Depression. She grew up in a small town in North Carolina. She was illiterate, she couldn't read or write. But like many grandmothers, she doted on me when I came to visit. She always made me my favorite meals and gave me those special grandma hugs. But she also taught me a lot of things in life, some that I don't remember, unfortunately, but one that stuck with me. And she taught me how to make patchwork quilts. And Grandma Annie used to have a bag that she hung on the door of her bedroom, Dave, called it the rag bag. And in this bag were discarded pieces of cloth that were used to be a tablecloth, but somebody spilled gravy on it, or it was a piece of clothing that is now too small, or whatever it might be. And Grandma Annie, because she was a child of the Depression, she saved everything. I don't even think we knew the word sustainability back then, but she would put these pieces of cloth in the rag bag. And when I came to visit every summer, we would take these pieces of rag out, put them on the floor, and we would cut around the stains. And we would create these amazing works of art. And Grandma Annie called them our magic quilts. And I used to think, why don't you just throw these pieces of dirty cloth in the trash? You don't need this. But Grandma Annie saw beyond what the cloth really was. So when I think about us as people, we're like those rags. Now, before somebody gets mad and starts putting stuff in the chat saying I called you a rag, I'm going to make a point here. Just like those pieces of cloth, we're like that. We're all cloth. We're all human beings. We are all have different utilities. We have different jobs or different things we do in life. But like those pieces of rag, we're different. We bring our own unique quality. But the combination of that quality, the combination of that energy, Dave, could create something so magnificent. I can't even find a word for it.
Mhm.
But the point is, instead of focusing on how different we are, let's celebrate our similarities, highlight those unique qualities, and create something better, create something stronger. So Grandma Annie understood that it wasn't the tablecloth that was the most important part of the tablecloth's journey. It's what she transformed it into. It's what it became. It became something bigger than it was on its own.
That's right.
So it as I thought about that experience in my life and started to do this work, I thought, wow, it's the connection that's really the important piece that
That's right.
sometimes we forget.
Wow, that's just so powerful. And I've heard that story multiple times. It still gives me goosebumps. I think Grandma Annie was ahead of her time here. I'm just reminded about how while we're all different, we're also connected to one another. We influence each
Yeah.
other. We're influenced by one another. But
Yeah.
you weave it all in. It's this beautiful tapestry of talent and perspectives and ideas. So I love that. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We want to leave a little room for Q&A, but just to summarize, we breezed through a number of different concepts today. We learned that unconscious bias is in all of us. It's part of who we are. It's part of our brain. We've offered a couple of strategies to essentially hack the system or retrain our brain through emotional intelligence and allyship, which to me is so impactful, especially for the audience today, many of whom are charged with leading the talent management life cycle in their own organization, whether it's acquiring or developing or retaining talent. And so we want to leave you with room for Q&A, but then also a little bit of a takeaway for you, a commitment exercise, because we want you to begin taking a little bit more control over this movement from unconscious bias to essentially flipping the script to conscious inclusion, which is an active mindset. And Clarissa, could you just speak to the notion of conscious inclusion and how it could, impact us for the better, and then that'll lead into our commitment exercise.
Absolutely, Dave. Thank you for that. Yeah, we learned a lot of different words today and theories and activities, tactics that you can use as you are working to transform your own unconscious bias. But what conscious inclusion is, Dave, it's taking theory and putting it into practice. It's really about using mindful approaches to transform our thinking and our focus on our amygdala to really pulling into that prefrontal cortex of part of our brain to access thinking, activities, and tactics as we are making decisions. So we're going to talk about this more when we meet the next time in November, but think about it like this. It's applied learning. It's taking theory and putting it into practice. It's really taking the concepts that we talked about today and applying action, because it's really interesting to talk about the amygdala and emotional intelligence. Please feel free to talk about the amygdala at your next cocktail party. That might be interesting. But the point is, you can talk about all sorts of things, right? But if you don't put them into action, if you don't mindfully put them into action, it's just a theory.
Right.
That's the difference. And that's what we're talking about with conscious inclusion. It's mindful, applied learning. It's taking theory and putting it into practice. And we'll get into more details about how to do that when we meet again in November.
Awesome. So we have a little interaction for everybody.
Yeah. One of the things we always like to do when we have a session like this is to have you reflect. Hopefully today touched you in some way, gave you some new information or some new perspectives that you'll think about. So we'd like to end this part of our session with what we call a commitment exercise. And we're going to do a poll so we can see what people are thinking. So what is one thing you'll do to challenge your own unconscious bias? Just one thing. Some of you on the call may say, I'm going to do all of this. But you know what? We've got that thing called life that we're also trying to navigate. So I'm just going to ask you, what is the one thing you'll do to challenge your own unconscious bias? Will you be curious and continue to learn about unconscious bias? Will you practice self-awareness? Will you practice self-regulation? Will you develop new relationships with people different than you? Will you use your privilege and influence to help marginalized or underrepresented people? Or will you call out bad behavior? So we're going to leave this poll up for a few seconds just to give you time to make a selection. And then we'll see what the audience came up with.
Great. And Ren, if you could just update us when the polls, looks like we have a good chunk of the people have responded, but there is a question while we're waiting here, Clarissa. An attendee asked, can we talk about constructive ways in which to call out inappropriate behaviors? How do you do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I'd say the first thing, and that's a longer than a 1 minute answer, but I'm going to try to give you the top line of opinion on that. The first thing to do is to not shame anybody. Sometimes people behave inappropriately and they don't know it. So let's say we were in a conference room, we were in a meeting, and let's say I was the only woman in the meeting. And let's say the men talked over me, or every time I had an idea, somebody talked over me. I wasn't able to use my voice, or maybe the person talked over me constantly, interrupted me, and you saw that. The time to talk about that is not in the meeting. You may say something like, Clarissa, I'd like to hear your perspective. That's okay. But the time to provide some feedback to the individual is one-on-one. So the first thing you say is, let's say I'm the person who interrupted Dave constantly. Clarissa, may I give you some feedback? Yeah, sure. Okay. I wanted to bring something to your awareness that you may not have even known you were doing. You kept cutting Dave off in the meeting as he was trying to make a point. No, I didn't. Actually, you did. And I wanted to bring it to your attention because. So pull the person to the side, not in a way to embarrass or shame them, but from a place of really wanting to help, a
Right.
place of really wanting to give them enlightenment and self-awareness that they may not have. That is a very short answer to a
That's a
much
great, very
longer and more
succinct.
complicated question.
That's true, because it could feel unsafe. That person may have that positional authority.
Right.
And so it's an awkward conversation, but it's so helpful to be on their side, avoid the shame piece, which may take them into defensiveness or guardedness.
Sure.
So thanks for sharing that. All right, Ren, how are we doing here on the poll?
We are looking good. I think responses have stopped. And so I am just going to share the results.
Okay.
That's excellent. So, Dave, everyone has selected something in each of these categories. And for that, we are so grateful. We're all on this journey. So it doesn't matter where you start. It matters that you start. So thank you so much for making those commitments and doing that. Don't feel like you have to boil the ocean and do everything. Just one thing.
Yeah. Start small, and you're probably doing some of these things already, but just pick one that you can try to do consistently and journal it, write it down, and track it and reflect on it. So thanks so much. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. And we're at the bottom of the hour here. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Clarissa said, I mean, we're on a journey. This is really forever work, and it definitely requires ongoing practice. If you're able to, please join us in November at the All Member Conference in Chicago. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into these concepts, and I think we are going to be able to share the recording of this or the slides following the presentation. So thanks all for joining us. Have a wonderful day. Remember, it takes the head and the heart to make this work. Be well, everyone.
So everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. We will be sending out this live recording to anyone who was signed up to attend. So those of you who are here, you will receive a link to the YouTube once it is uploaded, which should be done within the next 3 days. I will try to get it done before the weekend so that we have access to it. It will be available both to those who signed up and those who did not. So please do feel free to share within your organizations. We do have a couple additional questions that came out, and so I am going to note these so that we can try to follow up with you separately, just to be respectful of everyone's time, given that we only have about a minute left. And something that I do want to point out as well, we are really excited to have Dave and Clarissa joining us, as was mentioned, at our all-member conference for NCHL this November. It is going to be hosted at the Weston River North in Chicago. The session will be a little longer. It will be a little more of a deep dive into what we had to very briefly touch on today. And we're very much looking forward to learning more about this topic together. And so Dave and Carissa, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you, and I hope everyone here has a beautiful day. Take good care.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you,